All right. So yes, we are at our final panel again on Anita Chari's wonderful book, A User's Manual to Claire Fontaine. And so Anita is an associate professor of political science at the University of Oregon. And we'll start the panel hearing from Erin Manning and then Shannon Mariotti. Erin is a research chair in speculative pragmatism, art, and pedagogy at Concordia University in Montreal. She's the author most recently of the book Out of the Clear and also for a Pragmatics of the Useless. Shannon is professor of political science at Trinity University in San Antonio, and of course, the author of Contemplative Democracy that we just finished a panel on. And so I'll hand things over to Erin. Please take it away.
Well, thank you for having me. I didn't prepare a talk. What I did instead was um, find some quotes in the text that I thought spoke to the project, and I thought I might read them and perhaps say a few words to them, in the hope that Anita, they activate something in you afterwards, and that we could talk more. Want to say what a wonderful book this is, and also how generative it is for the times in which we're living. I think one of the big questions that many of us are busy with today is, where does art live under these conditions? At least as an artist, I feel that very strongly. So I'll just move through in a bit of a weave, and let's see if it opens up thought. Um, so the book opens with a beautiful quote by Sylvain Latringer, which has in the quote a sentence where he says, "Go straight to the source and capture the direct creative mode." And I thought it was such a beautiful way to open, because the question of capturing the direct creative mode, when the direct creative mode is not outside of the movement of thought, is, I think, what this book is doing. So I really think that this is a book that is radically reshaping what thought can be in the name of creativity, where creativity is not in any way in a kind of separation of theory and practice. And I'll talk more about this afterwards. Uh, Another thing that stands out at the beginning of the book, and something that I think would be really great to talk more about, is a mention of, and I quote, "a sickness perpetuated by critical theory." Thought as mobilized to consolidate knowledge is what I wrote in my notes. I've given a lot of thought over many years about the ways in which the institution mobilizes thought. Or, in fact, I think that the institutions in which we live don't really mobilize thought. They do everything they can to keep it at bay. And this keeping it at bay is often regulated by a certain movement, no, by a certain imperative to consolidate. And I've been thinking a little recently about what that means, um, which which is important to me because of work over years around neurotypicality. So what does it mean to demonstrate intelligence? How do we do that? And a primary way that it's done in the social sciences and humanities, but also in art, unfortunately, is to demonstrate a bird's view engagement with the world. And that strikes me as absolutely inherently white and colonial. Because who can have a bird's view? Only somebody who's feeling that their presence is intricately interwoven with the world. And so when I read what I felt was a sickness perpetuated by critical theory, that's what I heard, this kind of performative gesture of keeping the world at a distance in order to ascertain from a distance how it reconfirms our presuppositions of what has value. And close to that statement, there's a quotation by Adorno, which is a really striking one, where you write, with this is Adorno, contemporary sickness consists precisely in normality. And that, to my mind, really connected back to this, to the statement I just made about neurotypicality, which I think of more emphatically as normopathy, the pathology of the norm.
Mhm.
And what's important, I think, about normopathy, a term coined by Jean Horry and Felix Guattari, is that it is the one place where the pathology is excised, right? I mean, we name the pathology for what is distinguishable from the norm. We call it a pathology if it's autism, or we call it a pathology if it's ADHD. But actually, the pathology is the normative baseline. And I think that this book gives us a way into that modality, into a really active engagement with what non-pathological thought practice might entail. In a refusal of what you name the somatic violence of the white patriarchal gaze. So that's how I felt the beginning of the book, the project, the opening. And then there's this extraordinary statement on page 9, and I quote, such perceptual shifts, speaking of a somatic shift, such perceptual shifts are a material dimension of liberating perception, one that we seldom discuss in intellectual work. These arts of perception invoke dimensions that are invisible, illegible to the intellectual disciplines that are part of my lineage, including critical theory, which, like all academic disciplines, is largely bound to language as the criteria of its intelligibility. The moment you ask people in most academic spaces to feel their bodies, maybe you've tried it, a wall goes up. Resistance, defense, even from allies. I wanted to raise this paragraph, bring it to the forefront, and just give a little account of something that I experienced a year ago. I have a collaborator and student who's a Kurdish Syrian artist. Her name is Khajeh Baker. Khajeh is a refugee in Canada and decided in her 40s to do a PhD. And the academic institution kept asking her to find ways to make literature to put in language and into methodology an experience that was recolonized precisely in that gesture. And the academy couldn't figure out how, it couldn't recognize the ways in which it was abusing of the term decolonization in order to do this. They kept saying to Khajeh, you just need to write it. But Khajeh comes from a culture where she could never even say her Kurdish name in Syria. There was no opportunity for language to be mobilized for her because her culture could never express itself that way. So all of those other ways in which life moved into activity were very clearly given to her as the as a problem, let's say, for the academy, that the academy couldn't engage them. And the discourse that was dominant throughout the many years of my supervision was that she was a great artist, but that wasn't enough. I mention this because in the end, we defended a PhD, which I believe is the first in Canada without language. And I could tell you a lot more about this PhD, but it was of course, very controversial. But what was most extraordinary about it was that when we defended this space, so what we ended up doing is papering over a lot of space. People come in over a period of a month and write into it, and then we defended the writing in the space. That nobody left the defense. I've never seen a doctoral defense that nobody wanted to leave. And people stayed in the room for almost the whole day. Pretty much everybody was from different parts of the world. Um, people we call racialized, though I'm uncomfortable with the term because I always wonder why white people aren't racialized. But anyway, and and remarkable was how much thought there was in this space, right? How much opening for thought there was in the space. So this is what I thought about when I read that paragraph. Another paragraph that stood out for me, I mean, if I read all the paragraphs that stood out for me, I'd be here till tomorrow, so I won't read all of them, is the question of abstraction, which I think is a really important question in this book. And as somebody who teaches in a studio context, it's a question I'm very familiar with, which is to say that it's very, very common in an artistic context to allow abstraction only and formalism only to white artists. Everybody else is doing ethnic work, and everybody else is going to get questions about their personal alliance to the subject matter. So they're going to be asked, how their trans experience maps onto their art, or how their Indian experience maps onto their art, or how their whatever it is. And I think the way the book takes on the question of abstraction is really important. And I'll just read a citation we could maybe come back to afterwards. If abstraction belongs to whiteness, it is only to the extent that whiteness has maintained a possessive investment in a historically specific form of abstraction, one that obscures its own violence and disowns its withdrawal from the social dynamics that produce it, rather than assessing it as a property of abstraction itself. And then another quote a page later, continuing these discussions of abstraction as an aesthetic and political cultural objects, be they literary, visual, or sonic. This book swerves the conversation of the ethical implications of various forms of abstraction as a method within the practice of theory itself. So what I really loved about this is that on the one hand, it opens up the question of private property. How does abstraction in its relationships reify notions of private property, which are happening all the time in the art world? Because I think it would be very, very important to not separate the art world from the academic world. It is absolutely entwined. And, I could say a lot more about that, given that it's the place that I occupy. Um, but on the other side, what I love about it is that it reminds us not to create a concrete abstract binary, which is so, so tempting to do, right? When we're engaged, if we go back to L'Autringer saying that, like, go straight to the source and capture the direct creative mode, L'Autringer is not saying let's not be abstract, because that direct creative mode is full of abstraction. That's the beauty of creative practice, that it is open to all of those modalities of abstraction that allow it to swerve. That's what makes it creative, that it carries the speculative. And I think that this leads us to a concept that I've worked on quite a bit, that I feel is never mentioned in the book, but is very alive in the work of Claire Fontaine, and that is the concept of artfulness. So I'll just say a few words about artfulness because I think it might, and then I won't say much more, even though I'd like to. Um, it the concept of artfulness came to me when I had an exhibition where I felt that the exhibition was not alive. I really felt like the work was dead. But the curators kept telling me that the work was resolved, and I wondered what they meant by resolved, because it actually really, really did feel dead to me. And that thinking led me on a journey which became a book I wrote called The Minor Gesture. And I became interested in what activates a minor gesture in an artistic process. And why I began to understand why the minor gesture was so vital for me. In large part because it is generates the conditions for the work to come. Without a minor gesture, there just isn't more speculative reorientation. And So I went on a journey around the question of art because I think for many of us who are artists in this world of the prestige value of the market economy around art, there is a question of what the object could still do, if it is still doing anything. Um, of course, objects do things all the time, but how it's doing something, and it occurred to me that in in some languages, the word art is carried over. Like in the Romance languages, most Romance language use the word art as the descriptor of the thing we call art. Then in other languages, like in German and in Dutch, and I'm sure there are other examples, there's a word for art, but there's another word for art, which is Kunst. And the word Art doesn't mean art object. Like in German, die Art und Weise means the way. So then took me on a journey wondering when it happened etymologically that art became so tied to the object. And unsurprisingly, it's recent. And before that, what you had were processes. And so you have the very question of abstraction that is being raised before betraying itself through the etymology, which is to say, there's a moment that I think we're all very familiar with where colonization processes whiteness feel the need to separate the artisanal from the so-called contemporary, right? And so and that becomes a way to to do many things, amongst them create a market and create an individual as artist. Many artisanal practices are not individual practices. And so I became really, really curious about how and where we experience the re-enlivening of artfulness, which is what I'm calling art as way or art as process. And I mention this because it's clear to me that or it feels to me like this is a book that is all about that. That is all about finding within Claire Fontaine this activation of a processual opening toward the world that refuses a stark differentiation between objects and practice, between theories and works, that asks how the thought grows into a movement that precipitates different modes of taking form. And I'll just read a paragraph that I thought was really beautiful in this regard. It's very early in the book. It's on page 12. As such, art is the bearer of this capacity for emphatic, transformative, sensuous experience from which we have been severed. As Bernstein writes, the task of the arts is to rescue from cognitive and rational oblivion our embodied experience and the standing of unique, particular things as the proper objects of such experience, albeit in the form of a reminder or a promise. Without entering the epistemological labyrinth underlying such a claim, I suggest that this capacity for experience, a form of experience that can reconnect reified conceptuality with sensuousness, affect, and embodiment, is the major task of this. Contemporary art is the primary site in which we might accomplish it. So, what I'd like to say to maybe close these remarks is that I think that the site in which we accomplish this is through this kind of study that allows a book to travel into a conversation like this today, that allows artists to meet on the steps of a gallery to talk about the art, but also something else that brings us together in collective work in ways that are perhaps sideways, that gathers into intensity forms of process that are generative of material engagement and don't privilege spoken language over material engagement, that allow for the abstraction of thought without being in the policing of a certain kind of consolidation that would um, keep us in the weaponization of normative forms of knowledge and white forms of abstraction. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Erin. I'm gonna hand the mic to Shannon. Shannon, please take it
Great,
away.
thank you. I'm gonna set a timer for myself just so I have a general sense of when I'm at 15 minutes. So don't freak out if you hear this go off, and it's not your alarm clock. Everything's okay. So it's really a pleasure to be here and to get to celebrate Anita's book. And what I wanted to do is to give a little bit of an overview maybe of how this book fits into Anita's work generally. And Erin and I had a similar motivation here. I wanted to give you lots of examples of Anita's own voice as a writer because she's a really beautiful writer and your sentences are elegant and I want people to hear them. So I want to give an overview, give some examples of you speaking in this book. And then third, maybe identify a couple kindred spirits to this scholarly project. And then finally talk about magic more. So I've known Anita for about 10 years as a political theory colleague who also focuses on the Frankfurt School tradition of critical theory, as well as contemplative studies colleague who works to bridge academic work with embodied somatic practice, and as a teacher of trauma-informed pedagogy whose approach reshapes the dynamics of the classroom toward more holistic modes of learning. And I've gotten to encounter Anita in all of those different modes in her work. In all of these areas, Anita has always struck me as a truly trailblazing scholar for new modes of scholarship. Her strikingly sharp intellect is matched only by her bold commitment to move beyond what we can know through intellect alone. From early in her career to today, Anita has pushed beyond some of the conventional parameters of political theory that we've been disciplined to accept, to remind us of the knowledge contained in modes of perception that are sensory, embodied, and creative, and not just rational, abstract, and critical. She shows us what political theory generally, and critical theory in particular, can look like when practiced as a mode of embodied social change and as a feminist materialist praxis. These are fundamental concerns that unite her work from her first book, A Political Economy of the Senses, to A User's Manual to Claire. Is it Fontaine? Yes?
Yeah, technically, because they were born in France.
Right,
so,
that's
yeah.
what I just, that's the connection I just made. So à la français. Claire Fontaine. Even though the objects and the archives that are explored in these two books differ. But Anita's first book, takes up questions of alienation from sensory experiences through an engagement with Georg Lukács and Theodor Adorno. And even in this first book, she's writing at the register of higher theory, but she's motivated still by these transformative aims to bring the body back in, and that remind us of the creative elements that are always also contained within critique. Toward the end of this book, the first book, she's exploring the possibilities for aesthetic and perceptual changes through art in a way that works as a bridge to these commitments that animate the book that we're discussing today. And I want to do a couple things that sort of lay out parts of the book for people who haven't read it yet. And so we'll do that in a minute. But A User's Manual to Claire Fontaine works to dramatically expand what it can look like to do critical theory, while also at the same time providing an incisive theoretical analysis to the work of this artist. So in this book, I think Anita is continuing to participate in this lineage of bringing together critical theory with art that, is inherited from Benjamin and Adorno, as well as Rancière, but turning some of those sensibilities towards the concerns of feminist materialism and magic materialism. And we'll talk more about that. But I wanted to sort of parse out the title of the book, A User's Manual to Claire Fontaine. First, for those who maybe didn't know, Claire Fontaine is a collective made up of two individuals, Fulvia Carnevale, am I saying that right? And James Thornhill, who work as a feminine single collective, the artist Claire Fontaine. The name is lifted from a type of French stationery that if you Google Claire Fontaine, you'll see the artist, and then you'll also see a webpage like selling you paper. And this name marks the artist as a female person of French nationality. The name means clear fountain in French, and it's essentially a commercial brand. The two artists that produced the work under the name Claire Fontaine see themselves as her assistants. So Carnevale and Thornhill call themselves her assistants. So this works as Anita says, quote, to dismantle our often exalted, fetishized, and idealized picture of artistic labor and reveal that labor for what it also is, a form of care work that involves countless competencies that are often poorly remunerated and often unrecognized. So here we have our first transformation, the transformation of an ordinary paper company to the transformation of the ordinary into the extraordinary by this conceptual art. There are a number of different concepts that Anita takes up as she analyzes the artist, the tensions between mental and manual labor, some of which Erin referred to, art and theory, obviously mind and body, relationship and relationality, participation in dialogical exchange, recognition and imitation from a place of love, defunctionalization, institutional critique, human strike, tactile mimesis, desubjectivation, détournement, magic materialism, and feminist materialism. And we'll talk more about those two things. But second, a user's manual. Why call it a user's manual? And Anita says, I refer to this project as a user's manual because it seeks to reinvest theory with use value, resisting the dynamics of neoliberal knowledge industry that render knowledge in increasingly quantitative and extractive terms and sever knowledge production from the cultivation of capacities for relational, perceptual, and political life. So this concept of magic materialism and feminist materialism are the two big categories that Anita uses to understand the work of this artist. And so I want to read a longer paragraph that tries to parse out what this magic materialism is getting at. Anita writes, it's a paradigm shift in terms of the capacities that we understand ourselves to have as knowing subjects. And it's not about opposing the rational and the irrational. This is where magical materialism connects to a political project, because those dimensions of subjectivity that we've previously seen as weaknesses are seen as potential strengths. Magic materialism becomes a source of all those capacities that are inherent within us. This is opposed to a notion of subjectivity in which we segment ourselves into one atomized feeling body in relation to another, and then only connect through a very thin notion of rationality or language. In fact, we're always feeling each other at a much deeper level, but that empathic dimension is obscured by all of the dominating processes of communication and knowledge production that we use, end quote. And in an interview with the artist Claire Fontaine that's included in the book, they describe, or she describes, you had to have like figure how are you gonna say, right? I don't know, I'm just gonna roll with it. Claire Fontaine says, it's the first experience we have as humans to be totally empathic communication and nonverbal communication with another being in the womb. That's how we're created. And it's a power that we never lose. And it's this vision of kind of interdependency, but it becomes discouraged by society. So Anita takes some of these concepts and connects them with Italian autonomous feminism and this idea of social reproduction, and ordinary things, right? The kind of incredible source of strength that we can get from doing ordinary things with a high use value. Third, the motivation for the book, the one that Erin also referred to, is the sickness of critical theory. And this is the part of the book that that really resonates the most with me, right? Not as someone who thinks about art as much as I think about theory and critical theory. And Anita's description of the sickness of theory, I say it's a process that we may all go through at some point, right? It's the sickness of theory is an engagement with the vulnerability, sickness, and ableism that's at the heart of the neurotypical, heteronormative, white, self-optimistic, individualistic, neoliberal politics based on publicity, visibility, speech, and action, all markers that make up what it means to do politics in the conventional sense. Drawing from thinkers like Audre Lorde, as well as Judith Butler, Chari is interested in finding something that not only moves beyond that, right, but that doesn't replicate its violences. And she says on page 11, when you come to the edges of what scholarly expression allows you to say about your own life, the politics of the I become manifest. She notes that while many theorists, and we have a rich language of their work, while many theorists have critiqued the somatic violence of the white male patriarchal gaze, Chari wants to learn how to materially disarm it within myself and within collectives. Soften the space between your eyes. This is a quote. Back up your attention away from me, from the text. Feel the space in the field around your physical body, that interrelational space that we share. These are the perceptual shifts that are a material dimension of liberating perception, one that we seldom discuss in intellectual work. And she says very, insightfully, that as theorists, we write about these things a lot and we have all the right words to describe them, but we're still stuck, right, in this realm of language and limited by some of those academic disciplines. And so what you said here about the sickness of theory really reminded me of this passage that I just love because, it was like relatable when I read this. Again, I mentioned it earlier, but from J.K. Gibson Graham's book, where they talk about their evolution as theorists and sort of the first stage of their work as critical theorists and then later stages. And I submit to you, that maybe we go through this at different times, maybe especially as women in the academy who are critical theorists. They say this, they describe a post-capitalist politics as different from their previous work. It's wholesome, it's earnest, it's open, it's exposed, it's vulnerable. And they ask, quote, what, apart from menopause and the inevitable aging, has contributed to this kind of shift in stance and affect? Perhaps it has been our awakening to the different kinds of politics that are possible, along with an enhanced ability to hear them speak. And they describe their transformation from, quote, the theory sluts of 1996 to the self-help junkies of 2006. And I just think, like, I read that and I was like, yeah, I'm right there with you, buddy. Like, I know what you're talking about. And I think that there is a way that, especially as a woman in the academy, as a critical theorist, you prove yourself with these thinkers that then sort of become harmful at a certain stage in life. And that brings me to the fourth part, which is Anita's, I wanted to say relentless, but that's not the right word, tenacious commitment to bringing the body back in and to refusing to not let bodies be left out of our theorizing. And I want to read another quote because this is just beautifully put. We have many beautiful and terrible words for knowing these experiences of liberation and domination. The queer art of failure, the undercommons, homo soccer, necropolitics. The problem comes when the words hit a wall within the intellect. tempering their resonance, like a cymbal with a crack in it, a piano with a broken string. When the word strikes, the intellect doesn't vibrate enough to move the nether regions of being. And this feeling of dissociation, right, is an experience that you recount so vividly in the book, but also talking about this double bind, right, that we find ourselves in as scholars, where, quote, either use the scaffolding of scholarly production to voice your dissent, or be seen as illegible, inchoate, ignorant, crazy, naive, right? This is the double bind that we find ourselves in. So the first kindred spirit that the second kindred spirit that oh, look, my timer just went off. That was perfect. The second kindred spirit that your book really made me think of, and I'm sure you know this work, but if you don't, I think it's resonant, is Sylvia Federici's book, Beyond the Periphery of the Skin, Rethinking, Remaking, and Reclaiming the Body in Contemporary Capitalism. And part of what I love about this book is that she is, she is someone coming from political theory who speaks in praise of the dancing body, right? And the joyful dancing body. We think of this as an unusual move, but she reminds us of some of the same things that I think you have reminded us of so elegantly, which is that the body is a ground of resistance because, quote, its powers, this is Federici, its powers, the power to act, to transform itself in the world and the body as a natural limit to exploitation. She says, by the body as a natural limit, I refer to the structure of needs and desires created in us, not only by our conscious decisions or collective practices, but by millions of years of material evolution, the need for the sun, for the blue sky and the green of trees, for the smell of the woods and the oceans, the need for touching, smelling, sleeping, making love. And the language that Federici uses here, like the language you use, is magic, right? Magic becomes this way of thinking about the body's receptacle of powers, capacities, and resistances that we find hard to put into language. She says, I want to read another passage. There was a time when we could read the winds, the clouds, and the changes in the currents of rivers and seas. In pre-capitalist societies, people thought they had the power to fly, to have out-of-body experiences, to communicate, to speak with animals, and take on their powers and even shapeshift. They also thought that they could be in more places than one. And for example, they could come back from the grave to take revenge on their enemies. Not all these powers were imaginary. Daily contact with nature was the source of a great amount of knowledge. We now know, for instance, that the Polynesian populations used to travel the seas at night with only their body as their compass. They could tell from the vibrations of the waves the different ways to direct their boats to shores. We're alienated from these powers that we still don't understand very well under capitalism. But she reminds us that the dancing body contains a philosophy. And I think this is what was so resonant, is to see dance as central to this reappropriation. And she says, the act of dancing is an exploration and invention of what a body can do, of its capacities, its languages, and its articulations, of the strivings of our being. She describes that as a philosophy of dancing. And that just, when I read your book, that was what immediately came to mind because of the power, right, that you're trying to describe. And the best we have sometimes is magic to describe that, right? The power of bodies in proximity to each other and what they can do and all of these other things as well. So I had I wanted to hear more about that. I wanted to hear more about this sort of the magic part of magical materialism. And I also wanted you to talk more about something that I know we had conversations along the way. I know how you have worked to bring these sensibilities into your work in the academic space of the classroom, but I also wanted to hear how the experience of publishing this book was, because I know you had talked about that as something that, you know, you were committed to doing the book a certain way, but it wasn't fitting easily within some of the academic containers, right, that the publishing industry places upon us. So the first question is about, like, say more about magic. Second question is, tell me more about how disciplines discipline us through the publication process, right? And then third, this book is about art. And I wonder, but I know you think about somatic practices in a broad way too, that there are so many paths to this place. So what are the other ways that we can sort of work against the sickness of critical theory? And I wanted to read one more passage to bring us back from, this is my own voice, to bring us back to thinking about critical theory and political theory. I think if critical theory is sick, Anita, then you're a healer who is trying to cure it. And I see I want to sort of insist that you are a political theorist, because you are the kind of political theorist that we need. And I think what you are constantly trying to do is expand the parameters of the subfield, but I see you doing that in a way that really recovers the deeper meaning of political theory, maybe what drew us to it in the first place, before it came to designate a narrow specialization in a set of canonical texts in the Western political theory tradition. You remind us of what political theory is fundamentally about. You remember political theory, by which I mean you bring the body back into it. But political theory should always be about that bringing of ideals down to the ground of praxis. And it should always be about perception, and it should always be about embodiment. And so I really see your work recuperating the broader concerns of the subfield as it concerns the problems of how to live our everyday life. I think you expand political theory in ways that have a really deep fidelity to the heart of the discipline's enterprise and what it's always been about in reimagined ways. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Shannon. So yeah, gonna hand the mic over to Anita to respond to some of the comments from Erin and Shannon, and just anything else that you feel inspired to say about this beautiful book that you've produced.
Well, first of all, thank you so much. I'm overwhelmed by just the beauty of being seen, and by just the power of, you know, having this reflection back from two people whose work I respect so much, and who've been trailblazers in this set of concerns for a long time, and who've inspired me so much. It's really a beautiful experience, and thank you so much. Thank you also to James for creating the space, to Farah also, to everyone in this space who has been a part of contributing to being able to have this community, which I don't think I would have been able to think about these issues in this way without the support that having people who can reflect back to you in that way provides. There's just nothing else that can really match that. So I have a lot of gratitude, and I don't even know where to begin. It's a very funny experience to have written a book and then have it be reflected back to you, and then to be like in a space of I don't know, beautiful disorientation in that exchange. So I guess I took notes here, and I guess I'll start with just addressing some of Erin's comments, and then Shannon's, and maybe speak a little to some of the broader issues of the book that connect to what y'all raise. But you know, I think the way, Erin, that you talked about you know, the artfulness and the kind of process-oriented the process-oriented desire at the heart of the book, I think is so crucial. And for me, the interesting thing about this book was that, you know, in a way it's a book about an artist, and in a way it's not a book about an artist at all, right? And I feel like in the way that you described the project, and also just your comments, you being also an artist, I think understand what that exchange can be like, right? And how in a way, at the heart of what I wanted to do was to be able to, and this is, maybe this isn't the most beautiful word, but in a way to contaminate my own process, my own practice of theorizing through this contact with the process of an artist. And then in that exchange to see that being a theorist is in a way not that different from being an artist. If it's done in the way that Shannon was just speaking to, of that remembering of what brought us here, what was the desire to be a theorist, right? And Bernstein, you were reading from that quote in the introduction, but Bernstein was interesting for me in the way that he talked about, like, well, what is art, right? What is art? In a way, the idea that we even talk about art as a separate thing, right, as a separate aspect of life is a product of the reifications of modernity and of capitalism, for sure, but it's really due to the separation of the sensuousness and the capacity for this kind of form of perception from conceptualizing, right? That somehow those have been seen for quite a while now as fundamentally distinct practices, even though, of course, we know that, like, creating art involves conceptualization. We know that the practice of critical theory is a fundamentally creative practice and involves sensuousness and perception and embodiment, or can at its best, right? And did, like, if we think historically, right? I mean, even if you just think about, I mean, we can think about so many traditions, and, like, even if we just think about Aristotle walking around in circles, it's like there was not really our own period of doing critical theory and political theory, theorizing in this static format is a somewhat historically new formation. And, thinking to the other books that we've discussed today, if we think about, Shannon was talking in the last panel about political theory and critical theory as a wisdom tradition, right? So, if we understand that, then we can see how there's just so much robustness that gets lost in this narrow understanding of what theorizing is. And for me, part of my way out of that, in a way, part of my way out of that has always been, like, embodied practices and these other experiences that I could have that did not feel separate from my understandings of societal liberation, right? That political theory allowed me to articulate, but they didn't feel separate to me. And the capacity to, like, see an artist, Claire Fontaine, who was doing this in a way that really joined the more conceptual concerns with what I saw as really deeply affective issues, affective and perceptual issues, which I think any artist in a way is working with perception, for sure. But I think not all artists are so relentlessly in that space of trying to join theory and praxis, right? And so I found that to be a really interesting thing. I found that they were kind of grappling with the same issues that I was. And the opportunity to write a book about an artist kind of, and through in this, like, kind of dialogic and contaminating process, also, first of all, allowed me to kind of unsettle this distinction, this way that we practice the distinction between being a critic and being an artist, right? Or being a theorist and being a practitioner, because I saw myself as both fundamentally. And I saw that I didn't even see those as distinct roles anymore. And I wanted to be able to, if we take this within the realm of all these issues around, like, private property, the kind of commodification of intellectual property that we all locate ourselves in, right? We understand that, like, just like Claire Fontaine calls themselves Claire Fontaine as a kind of a nod to the inherent branding and entrepreneurialism of being an artist, right? One which causes them suffering, as I think it does most artists, right? But it's the same in academia in a lot of ways. It just, the dynamics are different, but we engage in a branding, a constant copyright of our concepts. And that process of that really appropriative process, right? And process of commodification of knowledge has an impact for our ability to use that knowledge as contributing to social practice, right? Forms of relationality, the resonance of the words that we use, essentially, right? So that's one, I feel like that was so, like, I really feel that Erin, like we like resonate so deeply in that space, and you do so much work in the space of really profound embodied practice, you know, with the sense lab work that you've done, with the work that you've done on touch, the politics of touch, the politics of kind of neurotypicality, and the perceptual issues at stake in that. So all that has actually been really resonant for me, and kind of finds its echoes in different ways in what I've tried to do here too. Yeah, on the sickness of critical theory, which you both discussed, you know, I'm so glad that point landed, because it was interesting to me when I wrote it, where I was like, I think I need to cut this part out. Like, I need to throw this part out. Like, this is not going to land. This is too navel gazing in terms of, you know, the theorist having to reflect, you know, me about the difficulties of doing a certain form of disembodied critical theory. But that truly was the motivation for me to come to this work, and really to all my work. But it was my motivation to be able to talk about that in a somewhat dialectical way through the work of Claire Fontaine, because what I could do there with an artist was to train my own sensibility, actually, and to have the tracking of that sensibility actually be part of the process of the writing of the book, which I found exciting and different than how I had learned to do critical theory, or how I had learned what critical theory is, you know, what it's legible as. So I really appreciated, Erin, the example you gave of your student, and the idea of, first of all, the idea that one insists on a recolonizing kind of vocabulary, rather than to try to make a different kind of sense out of what arises in the practices themselves, which is a much more interesting opportunity. It's a much more beautiful, liberatory, generative opportunity. And so, yeah, why don't we want to stay at a dissertation defense all day? Shouldn't we want to? Shouldn't we want to make these spaces be welcoming and holistic and embodied? And what does it take to do that? I think what it takes is to shift our sense of value. And that is ultimately what I wanted to do in the book, is really call into question what it is that we think we value as part of knowledge production in the world of theory. Because we have certain handed down understandings of what that would be. We definitely have to include deep studies of, like, you know, dead people and, like, you know, deep ones, multiple, and, you know, and I've done that too. So that's been an important part of my study and my work, and important work that I care about and love. But in this work, it was an interesting thing to be like, well, actually, I want to talk about this alive artist who's half a woman, you know, and a weird collective artist that has like a joke for a name, but who has really been immersed in the practice of theory. I mean, they're a very conceptual artist for sure. She's a very conceptual artist for sure. But Claire Fontaine is, you know, Fulvia Carnevale had also been a Foucault scholar before she joined with James Thornhill to create Claire Fontaine. And so to me, it was a very kind of anti-patriarchal gesture to kind of elevate this cultural object and set of practices from Claire Fontaine to be something I could discuss as a, you know, in the way that I saw Theodor Adorno, for example, talk about the work of Arnold Schoenberg as, you know, exemplary of certain dynamics that he wanted to discuss in capitalist society, right? Or the way that he talked about, like, the astrology column in the LA Times, you know, that these kinds of eccentric singularities actually became really fruitful and generative for thinking about deep questions about perception. But also that, yeah, that this artist to me is just as important as work that I've done writing, you know, about Marx, and which, you know, in my last book was much more in that style. And why not? So, but the question of why not, I think, takes me to some of the questions that Shannon was asking. And maybe well, Well, so first of all, to address the part about magic materialism, I mean, already we see why not there, because the very idea of magic materialism is kind of an out there concept, right? I mean, the idea of magic and the problems of the idea of reenchantment. But also the idea, I think, for Claire Fontaine in magical materialism is the idea that it's a materialism of the body. It's a materialism that doesn't force us, as Erin was talking about, to split concretion and abstraction as a kind of polarity or a binary or an either or. And that actually allows us to use some of these other capacities that we have for sensing the potent space of whether it be of art and the reception of art, or really just the potent space in political and cultural spaces, right? In relationality itself. So the idea of magical materialism was really generative for me and interesting for me in that way. Because I saw another person who also, as an artist, wanted to train those sensibilities. And I think as an artist, it's much more easy to talk about those things and to value them. And so that was another place where I could resonate with that, and through that dialogue, take it for myself and take it for ourselves. I think the part about publishing the book really, I think, touches on this question, this fundamental question about intellectual production, I think, because part of the desire to write a book about this eccentric subject of Claire Fontaine, as a political theorist, I mean, of course, you can write an art book about an artist, right? But this wasn't that, actually. It was in a way, it was a theory book. It was a critical theory book. In a way, I wanted it to be an expansive set of questions that went beyond just like, this is the biography of this artist. And like, you know, it wasn't meant to be that kind of a book. It was meant to be a generative conversation, but that didn't really make very much sense in any space, right? It's like, either you're just like writing a book about an artist. I'm not an art historian also, right? Or you're writing like a theory book where you're taking the artist as your object. And hopefully you're taking many of them, not just one. And you're kind of, you know, from that extracting a sort of concept from it. And I was very clear that I didn't want to do that and couldn't do that. Actually, I couldn't do it. There was something in me that was anathema to doing that, and I wouldn't do it. And so that did land me in a lot of problems in terms of the exchange value of the book. In the end, it was called a user's manual to Claire Fontaine, you know, precisely gesturing at my desire for it to have use value. But its exchange value was something that was actually pretty tough because in a way, academic presses weren't, it wasn't the type of book that would really work in that space. And it wasn't just an art book. And then what happened was that Claire Fontaine then they all of a sudden were chosen to be at the center of the 2024 Venice Biennial with the title of the curator of the biennial, Adriano Pedrosa, took the idea of Foreigners Everywhere, which was the series of works they had made over longer than a decade, as the title of the 2024 Venice Biennial. So then it was this moment for Claire Fontaine that then made their work more kind of on the stage of contemporary art. And so that became a really useful moment. But in another way, it was a huge struggle. And to be honest, this has been such a profound conversation for me, just because it's allowed me to talk about the book in a way that's not actually just about the artist, you know. And so that to have it be understood, the use of the book is so wonderful for me, actually. So I just have to appreciate you both. And I don't know how long I've spoken for, but I want to I thought I would, with just a few minutes, show a couple images, because I think it would be good for people in the audience just to see what the work looks like. And also I can reference a few of the issues and pieces that y'all were referencing. So actually, I wanted to, these are some of the images from the biennial, actually, where you can see this is the series of works called Foreigners Everywhere, which which is a neon series of the work of the name Foreigners Everywhere written in I think 30 to 40 different languages, and it was displayed in this very iconic place in the Arsenale of the Biennial. Another work, actually, I wanted to show on the issue of abstraction. If I can find it here, let's see. Oh, this one. So Erin had read that quote about abstraction and concretion, and actually it was one of the things that had helped me to think about it was this particular work, which is called Sensitive Content. And oh, I don't know why it might keep doing that. I'm not sure why. And if you look at this work for a moment, just to see what it is, I think it's really a profound piece. So what interested me about this work was that, at first it looks just kind of like an abstract sort of fuzzy piece which doesn't look figurative in any way, right? But if you look at it more deeply, then, and at least this was the experience that I had, all of a sudden the source material became very clear to me, and this was in 2020, so it was very much in the zeitgeist and in our awareness and consciousness. But the image that this is taken from is the image of George Floyd, who, the actual image that we saw circulating all the time of the moment when George Floyd had this police officer's foot on his neck. So a very brutal and violent moment, and an image that was circulated so much. And what was interesting to me about this work was that what it was trying to do was to think about what are the stakes of abstraction in a lot of ways. And when does abstraction reproduce violence? And when does abstraction actually serve to draw us deeper into deeper contact, into deeper concretion? And what is the relationship of those two moments? And how do we hone our sensibilities to start thinking and feeling into abstraction in different ways? Because I feel like in theory, we use abstraction as one of our major tools, but we seldom think about its stakes, or we seldom think about what does it mean? What are we abstracting from? What happens in our bodies as we engage in this process of abstraction, and what kinds of repair or recuperation do we need to do as we deploy techniques of abstraction? And as Erin was speaking to, not just to kind of then reinstitute concretion as its antidote, because that also has its problems of essentializing experience, of a certain kind of immediacy, of rejecting mediation. So I became interested in that process, actually. So maybe I'll just show one more piece, which, let's see, might have skipped over it. Sorry to take you through the wild ride here of images, but I guess I'll just show this piece here, which is called Burnt Unburnt, which this was the very first work I had seen by Claire Fontaine. And it was a work that really literally ignited in me the desire to write about them. And as you can see, it's a map of the United States in this instance, although they had deployed this work in many different contexts. And in any country that they had shown it in, it was in the shape of that country. So this one was shown in the United States. And it has matchsticks installed into the shape of the map of the United States. So it's a flammable work, and it's a kind of subversive invitation, in a way, to set the work on fire, to destroy itself, to have you destroy it, really. But of course, no one does destroy it, and I think that issue of private property then comes up, right? I'm not gonna give in to my impulses in relation to this work. I will not burn it, but I want to. That process, I think, was very interesting to me, because it was like this artwork was kind of speaking to these deeper instincts and impulses within me. And that process felt very important for theorists to understand, in a way, right? Can we get deeper? Can we get deeper into consciousness to start to think about these issues, about political impulses and desire in a way that's not just conceptual, but actually can make a certain kind of contact? And so I guess that's where I'll end, with just one of the major issues and things at stake for me here was an idea of just tactility, you know, of like, how do concepts become tactile? And how can we bring this more haptic dimension into what we call theory, what we call conceptualizing? And I feel like in the context of this attention economy that we have now, in the context of what we have going on with perception, I think James in the last panel referred to it as attentional fracking, which I found to be a super generative term. But that is something that we have to really consider in terms of what role theory plays in the context of the perceptual situation that we find ourselves in. And so I guess I'll just conclude there. I would really love to hear questions and say more of that.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Anita. And I'm so glad that you were able to show some of the art, which is included in the book. But for those who obviously haven't had a chance to read it yet, nice to get to see some of the art that you engage. Yeah, so maybe we will open it up to the broader audience and can raise your hand if you have a question. I see the ones already come in, which I'll turn to in a moment. If we do have any sort of gaps as people are gathering their thoughts, I strongly encourage Erin and Shannon to jump in for some continued conversation, given Anita's response to your really generative comments. And so, yeah, we'll go to Olga. Please ask your question.
Yeah, so the question is, you mentioned autism, which is really relevant to me because I have a formal autism diagnosis and how to break free from the neurotypical bonds that are put on autistic people. Is that like a big part of that book? Is like basically, is that included in your book?
Well, it's, you know, the reflection on the neurotypical is definitely something that I talk about in the introduction, but I wouldn't say it's like a major topic of the whole book. But I do think just the reflection on perception inherently touches on those issues, right? Because, and Erin has written on this in really interesting ways in, I think it's called Thought in, what is the name of that fantastic book? It's called
Thought in the Act.
Yeah, Thought in the Act. Yeah, which I had referenced in the last panel, actually. But there's a fantastic essay in that book that's specifically reflecting on these issues of like the neurotypical and neurodivergence and autism and kind of the form of consciousness that is specific to it and helping us to understand that. So in my book, I think it's more just that there's a more general need and impulse to reflect upon the politics of perception. And so in that sense, I do think it's very relevant to those concerns.
Thank you.
Thanks for the
What's the
question,
name
Olga.
of that book? Again, the one on the autism.
I'll write it in the, if you want to send me an email, Olga, I can recommend a lot of really amazing books that are engaging in that question by autistics who we've published, who I know, who, you know, I'll just send you a bibliography. But I wanted to say something in relation to that. I think, Olga, that my reading would be that Anita's book is very much engaged in this question, and I'll explain why I think that. There's a way of talking about neurodiversity that centers pathology. And it's in that way of talking about neurodiversity, you separate out neurodiversity on one end, or what some people call neurodivergence. And on the other side, you have the neurotypical, and the neurotypical is understood to be a person. But I don't think that that's true. I think that neurotypicality is a systemic baseline that organizes bodies, and really, really, really pragmatically, that shows us how to be in a body that looks like it's worthy of being human. So a body that sits in a certain way, a body that looks in a certain way, a body that speaks in a certain way. And some years ago, I suggested in one of my books that this could be considered as a kind of first identity politics in the sense that it organizes bodies without ever being named. And a really interesting thinker and scholar, Fred Moten, I can write his name, wrote me and said that he didn't think that Black bodies were ever given to neurotypicality. The way he said it was Black life is neurodiverse life. And that's the connection I would make to Anita's book. Right. So what the way I see, and Anita, you can speak for yourself, of course, but the way I see the book is it's a profoundly committed book to other ways of living. And that sees the ableism, the neurotypicality, the heteropatriarchy, the colonizing white gaze, and modality as deadly, you know, literally. And so in that way, it is absolutely a neurodiverse book, is what I would say. And I just want to say one more thing that I think just speaks so directly to what you were just saying, Anita. And I'm going to put the name in the chat because just in case you don't know. So I'm quite close to the community that knows itself by the name Protactile. And Protactile is a community of deafblind folks. It's a language and it's a culture. And it's about 15, the language itself is sort of between 15 and 20 years old. And if you're interested in, anybody's interested in it, you can look up John Lee Clark, who's written an amazing set of books, one called How We Communicate and one called Touch the Future. But the reason I'm mentioning John, so Protactile is a language on the body. It is a touch-based language. And the reason I mention it is that very early on, when I was becoming friends with John, he told me that some critical theory concepts could simply not become protactile words. They just couldn't be moved by touch. And we started to, and this came up because he was in the car with one of his sons, and he had just started reading my book, The Minor Gesture, and he said it was so easy to come up with a protactile word for the minor gesture. But he said, Erin, we've been trying to find a way to touch post-colonial for years, and we can't do it. And so we started thinking together about how some concepts are in an abstraction that really is in defiance to embodiment. Which doesn't mean that they're not interesting or they're not important, but it just means that they don't tether easily. And other concepts that tether so much more easily. And he and I then started to think about that in terms of also neurodiversity. So I just wanted to say that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you so much. That's interesting. I'll send you an email after this meeting for the books, so that in the future I can look at getting them or giving them as gifts to my friends.
Thank you. Not seeing any other hands. I might again use my chair's prerogative and throw a question into the mix. Maybe a bit of an effort to, or not really an effort, but just there's a bit of a tether from all three panels, just thinking back to the conversation around self-hatred and self-doubt in our conversation on David's book, and then also thinking about some of Shannon's work on paranoid versus reparative reading styles that you've said, what gives us that nice distinction. And then, of course, Anita, your point about the sickness of critical theory. And yeah, I would just love to hear your take on something I've been thinking about around just sort of this habit that we teach our students around locating the gap or the need in the literature for them to respond to. And so there's sort of this fundamental lack that we're constantly seeking, which actually makes a ton of sense around being able to justify the novelty of work so that we're not just kind of reinventing the wheel or not adequately attending to tradition, which is really important to attend to what other people have said. And so on the one hand, I feel some commitment to this project of locating the need by mapping the literature, finding what's missing, and then being able to explain why your work fills that need. And so on the one hand, I feel a commitment to it, but on the other hand, it's very driven, where we're constantly seeking what's missing. And I think there's a way that this sort of constant search for what's missing out in the literature can very easily get mirrored back inwards around what's missing with us, and we're not good enough, and that where's our lack and where's our need. And so there's a way that this very understandable habit of seeking the need or the lack can sort of feed into the sickness, if not of critical theory, of almost just academic production writ large. And so, how do we, I guess my question is what's your take on how to take this convention that has a lot of value to it and buffer ourselves from the neuroses that it can generate, basically maybe moving towards a more reparative approach versus the paranoid approach?
Yeah, I think about this so much because, yeah, as you say, there are purposes for it, but to want to be able to reference traditions, right? That we want to be in dialogue with one another. Yet so often how we end up being taught to relate to those traditions, our practices of citation, even, which is something I talk about in the book, are oriented around a certain proprietary way of doing that, rather than one that's oriented towards listening, right? I mean, really, isn't the point that we should be listening to other voices? We should be listening to the past. We should be listening to other really important discussions that are by people who have been thinking about similar things that we have, right? I mean, that's the purpose, but yet I feel like sometimes our citational practices are not about listening at all. They're about owning or appropriating. And I wonder if there's a way for us to work with that, right? To be able to think about when our practices of identifying gaps, or our practices of referencing and citation are oriented towards creating a copyright approach, right? Or a kind of land grab for the world of concepts, because that's not very oriented towards like a shared understanding of a world, right? Or a sense of, if we think about Shannon's panel last time, just about practices that help us to have a more holistic sense within a society that we want to make more democratic, let's say, right? I mean, so to me, it's about a communicational practice, right? It's a practice of communication. And I think the problem is that the way that structures of academic value work, it's very hard to move outside of that practice. Like in terms of even just how we teach, right? Like mentorship, we feel that we want our students to be able to survive within these contexts. And we do. Like, I want my students to be able to survive. I want them to be able to have meaningful work and all of that. And so we have this sense of what it took and how hard it was, and how one has to make value out of those parts of ourselves and sacrifice certain other parts. And so I wish that we could have a more open conversation about that, because about those politics of academic production, understanding, as you say, that it's not all bad. And I'm not saying that, but I do think that more space needs to be taken up by when I think of Fred Moten, I think of the idea of the undercommons, the idea of study, the idea of study as a form of practice that's not just about commodifying knowledge, arriving at some kind of practice that is useful in the most human sense to be able to survive unsurvivable conditions.
Well, super helpful. Thank you so much. So I'm just going to go in the order that I've seen the hands go up. Jessica, and then Farah.
Thank you again. I think I feel moved to share just that I'm struggling almost to emotionally regulate. I have so much joy and sense of affirmation having met you and listened to each of you. I have a short question that could be a short but big question that could be for the whole panel, and I have a longer, more personal, scholarly advice question So you can treat them as you like. The first is, I've heard the word creativity and the creativity showing up a lot in these conversations, and I'm wondering about is there a working definition? Um, Particularly, I guess you're speaking from the field of philosophy. I'm looking at theology, anthropology. There's so many ways of approaching it. And so I'd just love a report from the field of where to look or how that's working. My second question is about Anita, your description of writing this book that's neither fish nor fowl, of an art book and a critical theory book, or both fish and fowl, describes exactly where I'd like to be, where I find my thought falling as an emerging scholar. I'm like in the midst of writing my proposal, and I'm thinking about these new avenues such as research creation as a way to work these things in that, Erin, you're sharing about your student and the way, you know, a mature woman and all artist and mother has struggled kind of making their abilities and capacities intelligible to the academy. I'm just wanted to create space for advice to an emerging scholar that's aware of themselves. Is that, you know, do I play the game to get my driver's license, or, you know, what would you say?
These are such profound, difficult questions, but I so appreciate it.
I might just locate, I'm sorry to cut you off. I might locate myself as someone in art history and visual studies, and say also, Anita, that your book is just precisely where I think we should be going. So from the discipline of art history, like, well done.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, I would say about creativity, and maybe Shannon and Erin have great answers to this too. I mean, to me, I suppose I don't have a working definition of creativity, but I suppose that my way of navigating it has been through the body. That there's this particular way of engaging with the world and with concepts and with writing. I would say that's very true for me in terms of just as a writer, that has been about linking embodied experience with and creative impulse and as an experiment, and seeing what can arise from that, what kind of language could come out of that, what beneath language could come out of it, and what kinds of relationality. I think that's really important to me, is what kinds of relationality could emerge from that. So all of that to me was the space of creativity, but also understanding the quote Shannon put in the chat, I think is really crucial here, from Audre Lorde. You know, there are no new ideas, right? There are only new ways of making them felt. That very much resonates with me, and it resonates with the concerns of Claire Fontaine in a lot of ways. I admired this in them because when you're trying to create something new, you are within that cycle of commodification, you know. And if we understand creative more in the Arendtian sense, even of natality, you know, of the fact that it comes contingently through processes, but not through a kind of sovereignty, we'll have a very different understanding of what it is. So I don't know. I want to make sure I hear Farah's. Oh, your question about. I think, you know, I think I have a lot of. I'm very hesitant to just say we should just, you know, that you should just seek the path of intellectual intelligibility. You know, I think it has to, but I think it has to be I know that we all make compromises in certain ways around these things, but I do think that understanding your own vision around this is very, very much a primary thing. And understanding that, I think the academic publishing world is, at least there are more spaces now than there used to be, and a lot more interesting spaces, also because of the work of like people in here who, you know, I mean, Erin is somebody who really has published amazingly beautiful countercultural things to academia in academic presses, and same with Shannon's last book, the current book, Oxford Press, you know. So these things are possible, you know, and even though it wasn't possible for me exactly in this particular book, you know, I think my next book will actually probably be more at University Press. So I would say Yeah, focus on your impulses and your vision, but don't discount the fact that there are more spaces for these kinds of things.
I don't, that's a hard question and not one that you can, that someone else can answer for you. But I mean, I will just say, I was not courageous as an emerging scholar in the ways that I am now. And I am also a first generation college student who is just trying to fit in, right, in academic spaces and blend in, right? And I think part of my, I mean, this is the sickness of theory to some extent for me, Anita. It's not that I didn't love thinkers like Adorno, but I also was going to like choose the most notoriously difficult thinker to some extent, right? And like, you know, master that, right?
Yeah.
And like where that's really fucked up. You know, I mean, that's like really, I'm 48 now and I can say that's fucked up. I should have just written but it's complicated, right? Because I did genuinely love these thinkers, right? They're absolutely like Herbert Marcuse's one-dimensional man, right? In college, like that did it for me. Right? But I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. My dissertation was on Henry David Thoreau and Adorno, and both of them. And like one was kind of okay, and one was kind of edgy. And it's like, what the hell do these two have to do with each other, right? But that was sort of my thing. But I don't think I don't. This is not the first book I wrote, and there's a reason for that, right? I mean, the books that I did that are a little bit more edgy, I did them as a full professor or as an, you know, I did them once I had tenure, and it's not like I was strategizing. That was the point in my life where I had the courage to kind of just follow my own interests, right? I didn't, it was a question of I didn't have the kind of courage to do this stuff at an earlier stage in my career. I don't know. That's at least how it felt to me. Maybe other people always thought my work was weird, but I didn't think it was that weird. I don't know.
Thank you. I know that's a huge question. I guess I just want to reflect also just how meaningful these couple of hours together have been for me. And I hope that we can maybe continue some of these conversations.
Awesome.
I
Thank you
know
so much,
that
Jessica.
Sarah wants to talk, but can I say one quick thing?
Please.
Earlier on, Anita talked about how we can create the conditions for other ways of thinking together. And I think, James, you had that question as well. And what I often think about is that we are each other's police. So another way of answering that question, and I totally get what Shannon you're saying, is we could make it possible to have these kinds of books be written more. And I think that what often happens in academia is that we collectively keep that status quo in the place that it is by reviewing manuscripts the way we do, by saying to people that only certain people get to be creative. So I think it's a really, really important question. And I'm not saying that anything I'm saying will get you a job, because it won't. I'm just saying that I think that it is our collective question, not an individual question.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Farah.
You know, we're out of time, y'all, but so I gotta keep this as brief as possible. But this is really, I don't have anything very profound to say except to just want to thank, first of all, Anita for writing this book that has generated so much profound and truly deeply enriching and affirming conversation. Like, it's like people are reading my mind. Like, I feel like every comment that has been made, I was like, wait, but right? So like, it's just been so affirming to be able to know that like we're doing this together, we're thinking together, we're having this conversation that's tapping into what all of us are thinking and feeling and considering. And the thing that has been standing out for me is like, yes, you know, +1 to everything that Erin and Shannon and Jessica, all of you have been raising, like the policing, the disciplining, right? Like we're all participating in it, we're all complicit in it as much as we are, right, resisting it. And the thing that has occurred to me that I just, you know, really want to put on the table is the tyranny of speed. You know, the tyranny of we are all being pushed, policed, and disciplined to work fast and live fast, right? There's an urgency to everything. We must publish, we must do our next project. If we're not working on our next project, then what the fuck are we doing, right? Like nothing else has value in our lives if we're not being productive. And it really reminds me, a lot of this conversation, Anita, that we've had around your book today reminds me of another book that I really want to recommend to everyone called The Slow Professor, which I think is now almost a decade old. But I feel like so much of our conversation today has also really highlighted the extent to which we're all policed, disciplined, and really tyrannized by speed, right? We must move, we must go, 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 we must do, we must do. And if we're not, then we're not worthy, right? And I just feel like Anita's book and the conversation around it has been such an exemplar for us to remember what happens when we slow down, right? There's another book I really love that I'm sort of plowing my way through that's called How to Be Idle, right? Which is that like, and somebody asked, if I forget who asked about the definition of creativity. Creativity comes from idleness, from slowness, right? We cannot think and be creative unless we're being slow and idle, I think. So I just really want to thank you, Anita, for giving us the occasion to like affirm, right, that we can all do this. We can all slow down. We can all be idle. We can all open up that space for ourselves. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Farah.
Beautiful. That's I think a perfect way to end our time together. And so I just want to send, you know, big thanks and deep bows to all of you on this panel. Again, Anita, thank you for producing this beautiful, in all ways, like the object it's a beautiful object to
Yeah.
be with. So yeah, I want to comment on that for those who don't have it yet. It's absolutely gorgeous.
Yeah, I love that side, like the coloring on the side. It's great.
Yeah, absolutely. And then big thanks to Erin and Shannon for your beautiful and generative comments. And then thanks to all of everyone for being here. This has been a lovely day, de-alienating time together. As I said at the beginning, it's such a in many ways horrific and challenging time. And so being in community with you all has provided me with sustenance during this difficult time, especially as the border, I think most of us here in North America right now, the border between the US and Canada has become a little harder to cross, even for those who have a history of embodied privilege of being able to do so. And so, yeah, getting to be with you all has been really sustaining for me. And so, yeah, a big thanks. And I look forward to the next time we get to be together.
And thank you, James, for all the work you did to make this possible. I can't thank you enough.
Yes.
Oh, my absolute pleasure.
Thank you,
pleasure.
James, so much. And thank you to everybody. Thank you, Anita. Thank you, James.
Thank you, Shannon, Erin. It's been an honor.
It's good to meet some new people in Silverton and see some old friends and new friends.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye. See you
Bye,
later.
everyone.